Welcome to Falun Dafa Information Center's new show, the Falun Gong Bulletin, where we'll cover news from China and offer our insight and analysis on what happened and why it matters to us even right here in the West. On today's show, we'll cover two news stories. The first one is CECC's government action towards China, followed up by a nurses summit, which addresses the issue of forced organ harvesting. And we'll wrap up today's show with the story of one of the most courageous acts in Chinese history. Hi, I'm Ben Maloney, Digital Outreach Director for Falun Dafa Information Center.
And I'm Cynthia Sun, News Editor for Falun Dafa Information Center.
So Cynthia, why don't you take us through the news stories today?
First of all, the CECC is the Congressional Executive Commission on China. This year, they released their annual report, November 14th, and it detailed really important points that will affect the Falun Gong community and abroad. There's three major points in this report that I really wanted to highlight. The first is a judicial loophole called Article 300. This is part of the PRC criminal law that has persecuted nearly all Falun Gong practitioners this year.
Got it. So you say loophole because there's something about it that's unlawful, or it's not really like part of the law. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So actually, the persecution of Falun Gong is unconstitutional. Article 300 is the only loophole that judicial courts use to actually sentence Falun Gong practitioner. In China's constitution itself, it protects religious freedom, which is ironic because Falun Gong is considered a religious group. It's one of the largest spiritual groups in China, and yet they're using a criminal law to sentence these people to prison for years on end.
Got it. So tell us more about how the CECC has pointed out that this is a loophole.
The CECC basically said that this year, nearly all practitioners have been sentenced under Article 300, and then years past they have as well. So for the past 23 years, this article has been responsible for imprisoning thousands of Falun Gong practitioners against the Constitution, which actually bans discrimination and says, quote, citizens enjoy freedom of religious belief. This is Article 36 of the Chinese Constitution. Part 2 is evidence on forced organ harvesting. In the report, the CECC cited the American Journal of Transplantation and said it was highly likely that transplant surgeons in China had participated in the execution of prisoners by organ transplant, and continued to cite sources of forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners.
Right, and the execution, we should cover that. And they also said, to be specific, they said this was as recent as 2015 that we have evidence for. So as recent as, just 7 years ago.
Yeah.
But the execution part is important because what it essentially means is that Falun Gong practitioners and some other prisoners of conscience are illegally jailed. Then while they're alive, their organs are harvested by the state, and they are killed as a result of their organs being harvested, meaning they're executed for their organs being harvested, is essentially what the CEC is saying, that highly likely they participated in this execution process. Exactly.
And because of this evidence, I wanted to go to the third part of the report, which is where they recommend that, number one, administration should use existing laws to hold accountable these Chinese officials who are participating in forced organ harvesting and the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. The way that they can do that is through the Magnitsky Act. It was passed in 2012. Basically, Chinese officials their visas would be banned and their assets in America would be frozen. And so this would affect the officials beyond their sphere of control inside China, because the U.S. administration can't really control what's going on inside mainland China. But since there's a lot of assets and you're able to force them to not be able to come abroad or to pursue business transactions here, that way it'll actually affect these people directly. And so that's number one. Number two is the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. And this also condemns the CCP officials involved in the persecution of Falun Gong. So these are the two main recommendations for the U.S. administration.
I think there was another one that they mentioned.
Yeah. So this one, in trade agreements, the CECC recommends that the U.S. administration brings up religious freedom in the negotiation process. This one's a bit complex because right now human rights aren't really taken into account when it comes to trade agreements, like multilateral, bilateral trade agreements with China. But going forward, the CECC sees that this is actually beyond human rights and actually affects every sector of society. And we're trading with a criminal state, so we should actually bring up this issue as it's really, really important to the integrity of businesses, of the market.
Yeah, it's really important. I think the CECC mentions Falun Gong 32 times, which is a lot in the annual report. Clearly, this is still a huge issue going on in China. We know that, but for our viewers. And I think we should touch on a couple of the recommendations CEC makes. So the first one is actually not something new. It's something that the State Department of the of past few administrations have used to sanction Chinese officials. And it really matters. It really matters because it affects their ability to own property in the West. It affects their ability to send their kids to school in the West, which, as we know, is like a huge impetus for Chinese officials to send their kids to, some of the Ivy League schools in the West. It affects their ability to do that. That the number one reason that this is very effective is it actually affects on-the-ground actions in China. Because when those officials know word gets out that, your name is on a list, a government list, and, organizations like Falun Dafa Information Center and others collect those names from firsthand accounts within China, send those to the government. When they know that, hey, this torture I'm doing, this black jail or whatever is actually going to get out, then they're much less likely to do it. We know that from firsthand experience. And the second thing is that over the past many decades, China has used this sort of behind closed doors policy on forbidden topics, whether it be Falun Gong, Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, right? So their posture, especially around Falun Gong being the big third rail issue, is okay, we'll talk to you about human rights, but only behind closed doors. So, don't do that openly at the G20 summit. Don't do it openly when we meet. That's totally off limits. And most administrations have followed that because the idea was, we'll do it behind closed doors. But it actually doesn't work at all. And China has no intention of doing anything about human rights. Of course, we just talked about state-sponsored organ harvesting. They're responsible for that. They have no impetus to change. The reality is that they just want you to do that so there's no public pressure on them. They can kind of have this facade that nothing's really happening. And so those are two recommendations I think we definitely agree with. And I didn't know if there was more on kind of what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, so in the future, next year, 2023 and 2024, the CECC is calling for the release of practitioners, of Falun Gong practitioners, especially the citizen journalist Xu Na and Zhou Deyong, both practitioners that are highlighted on Falun Dafa Information Center's website. They're prisoners of conscience that have been persecuted before. Zhou Deyong especially has family in Florida. His son is a student in Florida and his wife works there. His release especially has been called on by Florida lawmakers. And so these two cases especially, but also for other practitioners that are, wrongfully detained, wrongfully sentenced. If these recommendations are really implemented, it would mean that high-ranking officials, like you said, would actually be held accountable for what they've been doing for the past 23 years. Just an increased awareness about this issue would really bring these crimes to light. Yeah, and I think it really segues nicely into our second update. This happened on November 1st. The Academy of Forensic Nursing and Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, two American-based NGOs, called upon experts to really speak about how to combat forced organ harvesting and protect medical ethics in the West. There were a lot of eyewitnesses who spoke out. Two in particular, Shen Li was actually a survivor of forced organ harvesting. She said that when she was imprisoned for being a Falun Gong practitioner, prison guards would take her blood 11 times a month, per month, not over the course of a year, per month. And so these reports were not for her health because she was being tortured in prison. Right. If they cared about her health, they would never have physically assaulted her in the first place. Her friend and his wife were both killed through forced organ harvesting. Her friend's wife died after a kidney transplant, after her kidney was taken out. When her friend tried to report the incident, he was assassinated by the prison guards just because of this incident. She has luckily escaped, but there was also another eyewitness by the surname of Jiang, and she said her father was actually warm when she went to see him. He was dead, but his body was still warm. And when they have video evidence of him being carted to the funeral home without their permission, and his body had rocks in the chest and like abnormal like skin conditions, and so they suspect that he was actually, his heart was taken, and then he never died before that. So that means through the organ transplant, her dad passed away.
Right.
Yeah. And so the speaker highlights and the entire recording will be in the link down below. But I think this is really important because it's going to be an inaugural event. So next year they'll also have an event in a similar fashion. And it really, there's a lot of potential in this because having a $1 billion transplant industry in China, and then seeing it being, founded upon these unethical transplant, means is really important for the medical community in America and Europe and in other places to see the truth for what it is and try to find ways to stop it. So a director at the DAFOH, which is the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, was really shocked by forced organ harvesting because it's overseen by the Chinese police and managed by the military.
This is actually a very important caveat. Maybe we can pause because a lot of our viewers in the U.S., and so they're thinking about, okay, well, we have the government, then we have hospitals, and we have doctors, and these things are all separate, right? Like go to medical school, you become a doctor, it's kind of, profession. But we have to point out that in China, it could not be more interconnected.
Exactly.
Not just in the medical community, everywhere. The government runs the organ transplant industry. The government runs these military hospitals that they pay for through the government to extract these organs. So this is not something that's separated from the government. In fact, it's orchestrated and carried out on behalf of the government. So you can't think of these doctors in China as, doctors like we would in the West. These are government agent doctors, if you will. Is that a correct understanding?
It's correct. And so they basically serve to, further the political ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party, which is why it's so often that prisoners of conscience and dissidents of the party will be the victims.
And it's part of the reason too, when people hear about forced organ harvesting, especially at the scale that's now starting to be proven for Falun Gong and even now some Uyghurs, evidence of Uyghurs, people can't really believe it, right? It's something that's so hard to believe because how could a doctor in good conscience do that? But it's important when you point out that it's not really a doctor doing it. It's it's a government doing it and makes it, this government's torturing and doing all these human rights abuses. It makes it easier to, in some ways, understand how it's happening, right?
And actually, one of the points brought up during the summit was that the Chinese physicians, many of them are actually trained in the West. They get their accreditation in the West. And this is one of the avenues by which, the Western medical community can actually, stop forced organ harvesting is by trying to limit the amount of applicants or to try to make them work in the West after they get accredited or educated here so that they won't go back to China and commit forced organ harvesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think that it seems encouraging that the medical community in the U.S. is starting to kind of band together and have a point of view around this to, themselves start to police it. Of course, we have Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act that's going through U.S. government now. So there's kind of government levels of it in the U.S., but it seems like there's some grassroots efforts here that's pretty interesting. Seems like a good place to segue into our feature story. We're going to talk about one of the most courageous acts in Chinese history, which was the hijacking of a TV broadcast in Changchun and Songyuan City in 2002. And the reason this is incredible is it's the largest civil disobedience act in Chinese history. So never before has a group of people broken through the Chinese Communist Party propaganda like this. And it hasn't happened since, and it hadn't happened before. And the reason why it's so relevant today is there's a new movie that's out that has the potential to be nominated for 3 Oscars in 3 different categories called Eternal Spring, and it's playing nationwide. I'd encourage everyone to go check it out. It's getting rave reviews in a lot of the major publications, and it tells this story of this broadcast hijack by 6 core members who all practice Falun Gong. And one of the members was a guy named Liu Chenjun, who was nicknamed Big Truck because he was sort of this larger-than-life character. He was a grain worker in Changchun, kind of big, kind of rough and tough guy. And his life story really parallels the rise of Falun Gong in China. And so what happened to him was, before he started practicing, he told this to a practitioner who I talked to recently, who was one of his cellmates in prison after they were both in prison for their faith. He said before he started practicing Falun Gong in China, he could not show up to work and still get paid. So his point was like, I'm kind of big and tough. And so if I don't show up, what is the boss going to do? Not pay me, right? And so he had this very kind of like, he was known as like this rough figure, right? Yeah. And he could kind of intimidate people. And he used that kind of as for his own gain. I'm not going to show up. You got to pay me. And when he started practicing Falun Gong, he totally changed. You know, he started to stand up for people that were weaker. He used his kind of toughness in very kind of righteous ways, which we'll talk about, especially after the persecution started. It really highlights what Falun Gong did to the fabric of Chinese society. So, you know, Falun Gong is kind of a self-improvement, kind of Buddhist school meditation that teaches people to act with truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance as guiding principles in their life and kind of look at themselves in situations. Another example would be that his cellmate, I talked to his cellmate, who was a government official in Changchun at the time. And as a government official, before he practiced Falun Gong, he got a ton of perks and benefits, right? Kind of corrupt, got a bunch of benefits. When he started practicing Falun Gong, they actually gave him a house. And he was a very young guy at the time, not married. They gave him a house as a perk. And an old lady came to him in the office and said, you know, I'm retiring soon. I really need the house. And he, without getting anything from her, just gave her the house, right? Because he, after practicing Falun Gong, kind of thought, hey, I don't need it. I really need to think of other people like Falun Gong teaches. So these 2 stories of these men that are related was the stories of millions and millions of people in China. So you can imagine that the fabric of society in China was changing from 1992 to 1999 when Falun Gong grew from 0 to 100 million people, 70 to 100 million people. 1 out of every 13 people in China was practicing Falun Gong. And so you could ride your bike into Changchun, for instance, 15 minutes you ride your bike, you see 6 different practice sites, people practicing Falun Gong exercises within the 1,000, at least 1,000 people each park. So it was kind of virality, right? It was spreading. People like Liu Chenjun, this ruffian, now kind of nice guy, were practicing Falun Gong. And so it was, you know, top Communist Party officials were practicing. The Communist Party invited Mr. Li Hongzhi, the founder of Falun Gong, to teach at the French embassy in the 90s to introduce it to the West. So Falun Gong was kind of being hailed by government officials everywhere in society. You know, it was the largest spiritual growth in Chinese and Asian history. So everything is kind of good, right? And you have all these improvements in society. It's tapping Chinese society into their roots, traditional culture, and this idea of kind of cultivation or self-improvement that they had roots in from Buddhism and Taoism. By all accounts, very good thing. But, you know, the problem from the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, specifically Jiang Zemin, who was the dictator at the time in China, was that the number of people practicing exceeded the number of people in the Chinese Communist Party. He also wanted to consolidate his power within China through kind of this struggle or movement. You can see that throughout Chinese history every 10 years. You have the student movement in 89, 99, you have Falun Gong. So there's this always kind of like rise of power through this iron fist, grouping people against, you know, a group of people. This is sort of Marxism 101. And so in 1999, they outlawed Falun Gong and started a brutal crackdown that, you know, has lasted until today, where they illegally jail, you know, brutally persecute, torture, kill, even forced organ harvesting, which we just discussed on today's show. When a government is going to do that, they need to turn the people against Falun Gong, right? So they need to somehow figure out, how do we get all the people in China with us? Liu Chenjun, right? He turns from this ruffian to a good person. People looked at him and said, wow, that's great. This Falun Gong thing, I'm riding my bike 15 minutes. I see all these people practicing. They've all changed. 1 out of 13 people. I know people that have practiced. It's not bad, like the Communist Party says, but the Communist Party is pumping out all this propaganda every night, right? They control all the media stations. So every night people are watching their TV and just pumping out lies, right? This is an evil cult. It's bad for society. And so but it's not really working because, again, people knew people that practiced, right? So 1999, 2000, it's not really working. they're still persecuting people, but the Chinese people have not turned on Falun Gong. And so this all changed and is very relevant to the story of the TV broadcast hijack, because this all changed in 2001. And in 2001, the Chinese Communist Party staged an act called the self-immolation in Tiananmen Square. And so they got these people that, the Washington Post did a story later, none of these people were ever found to practice Falun Gong. They got these people to set themselves on fire in an alleged protest, right? And the Chinese Communist Party had cameras set up beforehand. They had people on site with fire extinguishers, so it was total setup. And they filmed it. And the really sad part is they had a lady there that died, and her daughter was 12 years old, and her daughter actually later died in the hospital. And some people actually suspect that maybe the Chinese Communist Party ended her life because the truth was that they never practiced Falun Gong and they were afraid that the girl would speak out. But what was captured on video and cut later with the interviews after these people were burned and how they cut it was like, propaganda 101. And it made it seem like this weird Falun Gong group that they wanted people to feel like were weird or a cult had actually set themselves on fire, had convinced this lady and her daughter, who later died, right, to kill themselves, which of course is a lie. And so because it was pumped out night after night after night, really started to turn people against Falun Gong. And so that's the context. And then you turn back to somebody like Liu Chenjun, right, who changed so much, who gained so much from Falun Gong, who knew that it was this great thing in Chinese society, kind of this thread of fabric at the heart of China. And they want to tell their neighbors, this is wrong. You're being lied to. This is crazy, right? So they don't have any way to do that in Chinese society. The second you go out, people are going to Tiananmen Square and holding a banner, you're thrown into jail and you may never be seen again. So you really have no way to influence. So the way that, even to this day in China, people get the word out is they might post something on a wall, they might spray paint a wall, they might drop flyers at a door, they're printing stuff out on home computers and dropping it door to door like leaflets, or flying balloons in the air that, have messages. It's very, very grassroots, very, oppressive environment that they live in. And so this obviously doesn't have an effect on a large group of people because it's very hard, right, to pass out millions of flyers, for instance, without getting caught and thrown in jail. And so in 2002, it was so dire and people were losing their life and people were being lied to that Liu Chenjun and 5 other core people decided they wanted to get the message out that the self-immolation was a lie and that Falun Gong was good and it was being practiced all over the world. Like China should be proud. This was this thing that spread from China, was practiced all over the world. Nobody knew. And they made a program, an hour-long program that could kind of clarify the facts about what's really happening, the truth about what's really happening. And they figured out a way to tap directly into the nightly news and basically hijack it for an hour and play this video. And so it was a really daring thing to do at the risk of their own lives. And they did it in Chongqing City and Songyan City. And Liu Chenjun did it in Songyan City. And they reached over 1 million homes by doing that. And people, one of the people that was involved got a call from his boss that night. And he said, because he knew that this guy practiced Falun Gong. And he said, I didn't know. I'm so proud. Falun Gong is so great. I had no idea it was practiced in, France in front of the Eiffel Tower, and they had all these clips. And so it really had a huge impact, which was a great thing. But you can imagine, we've talked about Jiang Zemin and his reaction to the Falun Gong and how they're persecuting people to death and setting, children on fire essentially to persecute Falun Gong. And then you have this happen. And he was furious. He calls Chongqing that night and allegedly says, basically to kill whoever you need to kill, essentially, right? You kill them without mercy is kind of the quote that was attributed. And police are given the orders to shoot on sight of any practitioners. So it unleashed this terror at that time in 2002 in Chongqing especially, where, Amnesty actually issued an emergency release talking about the incident at that time. And, over the days that followed, practitioners died. Thousands were rounded up. It was like this kind of sky is falling moment in Chongqing. And of course, their mission was to get the people that were responsible for the broadcast. And so Liu Chenjun was actually hiding at his aunt's house in the countryside. And he was in a kind of a grass kind of shack in the backyard. And the police went there and found him and they set it on fire. And he came out. And then when he came out, he had already surrendered, but they shot him in the foot twice and said something to the effect of like, try to run now. When they captured him, and they detained him and they put him in jail, this was in 2002, late 2002, they it was really brutal torture for him at that time. And when the Chinese authorities torture Falun Gong practitioners in prison, they really want a couple of things, but they mainly want one thing. They mainly want you to renounce your faith. So what they try to do is they try to torture you so badly through many means. For him, it was this torture method called the tiger bench. It was whipping him in the eyes with belts. It was, just torture where he couldn't really walk after, just the most brutal medieval torture you could imagine. And they want you to sign a statement saying, I give up Falun Gong, which when you think about it, why do they want that? Why does the practice matter to them so much? And it gets to this deep psychological factor about controlling everything. They want to break your spirit and they want to break your will and they want to control every part of your life. With somebody like Liu Chenjun, this kind of strong, noble character, they could take his freedom, they could torture him, but they could never take that part of the faith that he had. And he never, ever relented his faith. And not only did not relent his faith, but over the time that he was in that prison, I talked to several people that were with him at that time. I talked to them very recently, and they were telling me, he would stand up for weaker people, right? So when the police would go and try to persecute other practitioners in the jail, he would stand in front of that practitioner. And actually, because he had this kind of physical presence, he was big, police were actually afraid of him. And so it would have an effect where either he would take the beating or he would stop the other person from getting persecuted. And so you can see this man that, started his life as this ruffian that, was using it for his own good to get paid when he didn't have to go to work, to this guy that in prison is standing up for others. And it's a really important point that, I would draw parallels to something I learned about growing up, going to Hebrew school in the Jewish community, which is Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And in that book, Viktor Frankl went through the Holocaust. It's an amazing book. And he talks about sort of when man has meaning and kind of this faith and hope can get through any situation. And it's sort of about, how you're reacting to these horrible conditions around you. And I would draw a parallel to Liu Chenjun in that environment, that they could not break his kind of iron will, right? And he had this kind of faith about him that was unbreakable. And there's an amazing story of him towards his last days in the labor camp. At that time, Falun Gong practitioners could not actually speak to each other. So the guards would not let you talk. They would beat you if you talked. You could barely look at each other, right? They didn't want people communicating and kind of almost encouraging each other, right? They wanted to break your will. So Liu Chenjun was on his last legs. He was in the cell. And I was told a story where he saw that a much younger practitioner's clothes were torn, and he found a needle with a thread. And so he picked up the practitioner's clothes, on his last breath. He would die soon after this. Liu Chenjun would die soon after this as a result of torture in prison. And he was sewing the practitioner's clothes. And as he was sewing the practitioner's clothes, he sang a song for all the practitioners there about faith. And as he sang the song, everyone's kind of crying, because that act alone, to sing a song in that environment, could have meant his life, and later would, take his life, not soon after. And you think about, faith, and you think about standing up, and what is courage, and what is, sacrifice for something you believe in. You think of people like Liu Chenjun, and you think about the grassroots efforts of the 6 core members who were all persecuted to death as a result of that TV hijack. And you think about today in China, Falun Gong is still brutally persecuted. People are still in the labor camps. And how do you figure out ways that they can have a voice? Because in China, they're still doing grassroots efforts. But here in the West, of course, we have many ways to get the voice out. And so for us here at Falun Dafa Information Center, we're a voice for people like Liu Chenjun and the millions of Falun Gong practitioners that can't tell their story. And so I'd encourage everyone, watching this to share it, right? And use our voice and our freedom to put pressure on China to end this persecution.
Yeah. And to watch Eternal Spring.
Yeah, and absolutely. And if you get a chance, watch Eternal Spring, and hopefully gets nominated for Oscars. But it's an incredibly moving story that tells Liu Chenjun, big truck story, as well as the story of many practitioners there. And it's such a daring display of courage. So thank you for joining us today for the Falun Gong Bulletin, and we'll see you next time.